Our first picture today, appropriately enough, that's David Flynn, and since he's the subject of another story in our report, we'll start with this picture. This picture was taken in the fall of 1979. You'll recognize David Flynn, class of 58, and Rosalind Carter. And the reason their two are together is because David Flynn was the Massachusetts campaign manager for the re-election of Jimmy Carter. So he was constantly in Washington, frequently in Boston, meeting with members of the Democratic Party, and accompanying the president's wife, Mrs. Carter, on her trips, various trips to Boston. This photograph was taken on a Saturday morning, just outside the Parker House, where she had had a luncheon with legislative leaders. As we all know, Jimmy Carter did not go on to win re-election, but David Flynn was a loyal Democrat and active in just about every presidential campaign throughout his adult life. Most of us will recognize the two people in this picture. This was taken in August of 1989. And over here we see newly elected President Adrian Tinsley. And on this side, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. The governor had invited Dr. Tinsley to come to the State House to meet with him. She had just started a few weeks earlier as the president of Bridgewater State University, Bridgewater State College at the time, and he was very instrumental in the effort to bring Dr. Tinsley to Bridgewater. By the way, mentioning Dave Flynn was in the cabinet of Mike Dukakis in the Office of Administration and Finance. He and Mike Dukakis had a long friendship, and in fact, when David retired from state government in 2011, Mike Dukakis came to Bridgewater to attend a fundraiser in celebration in honor of Dave's long service to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. This is such an important and interesting picture of our first, what we believe is our first African-American graduate, Sarah Ann Lewis. She entered the school, which was then Bridgewater State Normal School, on February 19th, 1867. She entered the two-year program. She graduated in 1869 and continued on to teach in her hometown of Fall River. There's so many interesting aspects to the life of Sarah Ann Lewis. Certainly one of the most interesting from the university's perspective is that for many years we did not know that she existed. For a good long time we believed that our first African-American graduate was in 1912, and then suddenly we found out that was not true, that we had a much earlier graduate who was African-American. And it was discovered by Dr. Thomas Turner, Professor Emeritus of History, and just purely by accident did Dr. Turner discover it. He was doing research on what is a monumental book, A History of the University. It was published in 2010. And in the mid-2000s, he was in the Maxwell Library doing research for this history that he was writing. And as he told me the story, he was up in the Special Collections area with Mrs. Maybelle Bates, the Special Collections librarian. And he said he took a break for lunch, and he was sitting down at a desk, and there were some books nearby, and one of them happened to be, he noticed, was a photo album. And he opened the album, and there were pictures of students. Now, the pictures were pasted into the book because in the 19th century, it was impossible to print a picture in a book. Technically, it was impossible. Technically impossible. So pictures that we had were pasted. They were photographs taken and then pasted into books. And so Dr. Turner was just casually leafing through the pages, and he came across this photograph of Sarah Ann Lewis, and he did research after that to confirm her identity and her background. Research was also done by Dr. Philip Sylvia, who is a native of Fall River and has written often about the city of Fall River. So both of those two scholars have written extensively about Sarah Ann Lewis, who we believe is our first African American graduate. There may have been one earlier, we're not sure, or one or two, not sure, but that's the information we have as of the moment, and so that's how we have come to recognize her as the first African American to graduate from the university. Another of our esteemed early graduates is Shuji Izawa, and Shuji Izawa attended Bridgewater State Normal School from 1875 to 1878. Remarkable figure here in this country and also in his native Japan. After he returned to his native Japan, he was a leading educational figure, particularly in the field of music. And his statue still exists in Tokyo. Dr. Wing Kai-to of our Global Affairs staff has been to see his statue in Japan. And there are so many stories associated with the Shuji Izawa. One of the most important ones is that he worked with Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, who happened to be in Boston at the same time Mr. Izawa was in Bridgewater. And they made a connection, and at one point we know that from Mr. Izawa's memoirs that he went to Boston and visited with Alexander Graham Bell. And in fact, he said to Mr. Bell, is it possible that your machine will hear Japanese? And if I speak Japanese, you'll be able to hear it, Japanese. And Mr. Bell assured him that any language would be heard over the telephone. And they did the experiment, and Mr. Izawa was indeed quite impressed. He is a legendary figure in Japan, and years after he graduated, back in 1915, toward the end of Alfred Gardner Boyden's tenure as the third president of Bridgewater, Mr. Izawa wrote a note explaining to Mr. Boyden how grateful he was for his Bridgewater education. And he signed his note, "This is from your son in the land of the rising sun." So Shuji Izawa is a stalwart figure in our history, and if you go up to the third floor of the Maxwell Library, you'll see a nice portrait of him that hangs there. And so he is another one of the figures from our earlier history that we honor and revere. This is a picture of historical significance. It was taken on December 2nd, 2014 in Boston at the offices of the Board of Higher Education. And at that occasion, Fred Clark was officially appointed the 12th president of Bridgewater State University. Over here we see Mr. Lou Ricciardi, class of 81. And Lou was at the time the chairman of the Bridgewater State Board of Trustees, and he was also vice chairman of the Mass Board of Higher Education. Dr. Dana Molifaria, the 11th president of Bridgewater, he would retire in 2015. Of course, President Clark. Mr. Charles Desmond, and Mr. Desmond was then chairman of the Massachusetts Board of Higher Education. And over here, our old friend Gene Durgan. Gene is now the chair of the Board of Trustees Emeritus at Bridgewater State University after a very long term of service. This picture again was taken in Boston on the day that the president was appointed to his position. And it's significant because this September marks the beginning of his 10th year as the president of Bridgewater State University. So for that reason, I wanted to share this picture with you for its historical significance. We end this week's survey of old photographs with this picture right here. You may not recognize her, but the name will be familiar. This is Eliza Bond Woodward. And we know a lot about Eliza because she spent her life here. I'll give you a little bit of background on her biography. She was born in Haverhill, New Hampshire on January 8th, 1827. And she entered the State Normal School as a pupil on March 19th, 1856. According to the student newspaper, the Normal Offering, published in 1887, it said that she was a student distinguished by her scholarship, her genial manner, maturity of judgment, and nobility of character. Immediately upon her graduation, she was appointed assistant teacher in the school, a position which only 2 ladies had previously held. She began her duties in September of 1857, and again, according to the newspaper, continued them without interruption for 30 years. In July of 1887, she became ill and left the school to join her sister in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and from there she went on to her greater reward at the age of 67. So that is Eliza Bond Woodward, and we are always conscious of her name because Woodward Hall was, which was built in 1911, is our oldest dorm, and it was called New Dorm from 1911 until 1917. In 1917, what we now know as Woodward Hall was named for her. So in her honor, in her memory, the college named Woodward Hall for her. And the name, again, is one we hear all the time, and this is the person behind the name. Thank you for watching this week's installment. We'll be back again with more pictures next week.